For as long as I can remember, there was a sentence that followed me like a shadow. It must have been Evelyn. In our house, mistakes didn't need proof. They just needed a name. And that name was mine. My name is Evelyn Harper, and for 20 years, I was the family scapegoat. If you've ever felt like the one who gets blamed first and heard last, then you're going to understand this story deeply. Before I take you back to the night I realized my place in the Harper family was already decided, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next in this journey. Hit the subscription button and in the comments section, tell me which country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story is traveling and how many hearts across the world connect to Evelyn's journey. It reminds us that pain and strength don't belong to just one place in the world. I was 8 years old when I first understood that love in our home came with conditions. It was Thanksgiving, the kind with polished silverware and a turkey my mother, Patricia Harper, treated like a sacred offering. My older sister, Madison Harper, was standing near the kitchen counter, twirling in a new cream-colored dress. She was 14, already glowing with the kind of attention that seemed to follow her effortlessly. Relatives hovered around her, asking about her grades, her friends, her plans. She answered with perfect posture and an even more perfect smile. I was in the dining room, trying to help set the table. I remember wanting so badly to do it right. I counted the forks twice. I lined up the glasses carefully. I told myself that if I did everything perfectly, maybe this time I wouldn't hear my name in that tone. Then it happened. A glass shattered on the floor. The sound sliced through the room like a siren. Everyone froze. Madison stood near the edge of the table, her hand still hovering in the air where the glass had been. For a second, just 1 second, our eyes met. It must have been Evelyn, my mother said before anyone asked. No hesitation. No question. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words felt heavy and slow. I didn't. Why can't you ever be careful? Patricia snapped, already reaching for a towel. You're always ruining something. The room shifted. My father, Richard Harper, didn't look at me. He bent down to help clean up the glass without saying a word. My aunt shook her head softly, as if this was a familiar disappointment. Madison lowered her gaze, but not before I caught the flicker of relief in her eyes. And just like that, the story was written. I had broken the glass. I had disrupted dinner. I had embarrassed the family. I helped clean up my own crime. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying it over and over. I knew I hadn't touched the glass. I knew what I saw. But there was something more powerful than truth in our house. There was narrative. And the narrative was simple: Madison shined. Evelyn stumbled. As the years passed, that pattern only deepened. If Madison missed curfew, it was because she was overwhelmed with extracurricular responsibilities. If I came home 5 minutes late from the library, it was because I was irresponsible. When Madison brought home a B, my mother blamed the teacher. When I brought home an A, she asked why it wasn't an A+. At family gatherings, Madison was introduced with pride. This is our star, Patricia would say, her hand resting gently on Madison's shoulder. When it came to me, the introduction was shorter. And this is Evelyn. No adjectives. No warmth. Just my name, hanging in the air without celebration. What hurt the most wasn't the blame. It was the silence. My father rarely defended me. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He was simply absent in the moments that mattered. Silence can feel like agreement when you're the one standing alone. There were nights I sat at my desk staring at my reflection in the darkened window, asking myself what was wrong with me. I studied harder. I spoke softer. I tried to anticipate mistakes before they happened. I became careful with my movements, careful with my words, careful with my very existence. And still, somehow, it was always me. But there was one pair of eyes in that house that didn't look at me with disappointment. My grandfather, Theodore Whitmore, would visit on Sundays. He had a quiet presence, the kind that didn't demand attention but commanded respect anyway. While everyone else focused on Madison's achievements, he would ask me questions. Real ones. About what I was reading. About what I thought. About what I wanted. You observe more than you speak, he once told me, his voice low and thoughtful. That's not weakness, Evelyn. That's awareness. No one had ever described me as anything other than difficult or careless. Hearing him say that felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a dim room. I didn't know it then, but those quiet Sunday conversations would matter more than I could ever imagine. At 14, I stopped defending myself when accusations came. At 16, I stopped expecting fairness. By 18, I had mastered the art of absorbing blame with a calm face. It was easier that way. Less exhausting than fighting a story everyone else had already agreed on. But deep down, beneath the layers of self-doubt, there was a small, steady voice that whispered something different. It told me I wasn't careless. I wasn't the problem. I was simply convenient. And sometimes, being the convenient villain in someone else's story says more about them than it does about you. I didn't know how that truth would surface. I didn't know that years later, a single letter would force everyone in that family to confront the narrative they had built around me. All I knew in those early years was that I was tired of being the name attached to every broken thing. If you've ever carried blame that wasn't yours, if you've ever been labeled before you were understood, then stay with me. And don't forget to subscribe and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I want to see how many voices across the world know what it feels like to be the one they point to first. Because this was only the beginning of what the Harper family thought they knew about Evelyn Harper. By the time I turned 16, the roles in our family were no longer accidental. They were established. Reinforced. Repeated so often that even outsiders could sense them within minutes of stepping into our home. Madison Harper was the golden child. I was the cautionary tale. It didn't matter what the situation was. Somehow, the light always found her, and the shadow always found me. Madison didn't just receive attention, she lived inside it. When she entered a room, conversations adjusted. When she spoke, people leaned in. My mother, Patricia Harper, watched her like an investment that had already proven profitable. Every achievement Madison collected was displayed like a trophy that reflected directly on her parenting. A debate team win became proof of discipline. A college acceptance letter became evidence of superior guidance. When Madison decided she wanted to major in business, my mother called it vision. When I said I wanted to study literature, she called it impractical. I learned quickly that approval in our home was not based on effort but on alignment. Madison aligned perfectly with what Patricia valued: status, visibility, admiration. I aligned with questions, quiet observation, and ideas that didn't translate into applause at dinner parties. At school, Madison floated through hallways with confidence that bordered on untouchable. Teachers praised her leadership. Friends admired her wardrobe. Parents complimented her manners. I walked the same hallways but experienced a different reality. I kept my head down, not because I lacked ability, but because I had grown tired of standing out for the wrong reasons. The comparisons were constant, sometimes subtle, sometimes blunt. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" was a sentence that no longer surprised me. It arrived casually, like a routine reminder of my position. My father, Richard Harper, remained consistent in his quiet neutrality. He paid the bills, attended events, nodded at achievements, and avoided conflict like it was a fire he refused to approach. I used to hope he would defend me just once. Just once say, "That's not fair." But fairness requires confrontation, and confrontation was something he never chose. The most painful moments were not the dramatic arguments, they were the ordinary evenings that revealed everything without raised voices. One night, Madison came home after missing curfew by nearly an hour. My mother paced the living room, but when Madison walked in, breathless and apologetic, Patricia's anger softened within seconds. "You should have called," she said, pulling her into a brief hug. "We were worried." 2 weeks later, I stayed after school to finish a project in the library. I called ahead. I explained. I even texted updates. Yet when I stepped through the front door 10 minutes later than expected, my mother's expression hardened immediately. "Irresponsible," she said flatly. "You don't think about anyone but yourself." The difference wasn't in our actions. It was in our labels. Madison was trusted. I was doubted. And over time, doubt becomes a lens that distorts everything you do. I began double-checking my words before speaking. I apologized even when I wasn't wrong. I absorbed criticism as if it were proof of something defective inside me. But something else was happening quietly beneath the surface. While Madison built her image, I built resilience. While she relied on validation, I learned independence. I found comfort in books, in writing, in spaces where performance didn't determine worth. It was around this time that my grandfather, Theodore Whitmore, started paying closer attention. During Sunday visits, he would sit across from me and ask about what I was reading. Not in a distracted way, but with genuine curiosity. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions. He treated my thoughts like they mattered. One afternoon, after listening to my mother praise Madison's internship opportunity for nearly 20 minutes, he turned to me and said, "And what about you, Evelyn? What are you building?" No one had asked me that before. Not what I achieved. Not what I failed at. But what I was building. The question lingered long after he left. I realized then that while my family measured success by visibility, my grandfather measured it by substance. Madison's life looked impressive on the outside, polished and celebrated. Mine looked quieter, less glamorous. But quiet does not mean empty. It means growing roots where no one thinks to look. There were moments when I wondered if Madison noticed the imbalance. If she ever questioned why praise flowed so easily toward her while scrutiny followed me. Sometimes I caught glimpses of awareness in her expression, brief flashes of discomfort before she settled back into the role she had mastered. It wasn't entirely her fault. Favoritism can feel like love when you're the one receiving it. But it reshapes everyone involved. By the time I graduated high school, the pattern felt permanent. Madison stood center stage at her celebration dinner, glowing under compliments about her future. I sat at the same table, smiling politely, already planning my quiet exit into adulthood. I stopped trying to compete for a spotlight that was never meant for me. Instead, I focused on building something internal, confidence that didn't depend on applause, clarity that didn't require agreement. What my family didn't understand was that being underestimated can become an advantage. When no one expects you to rise, they stop watching closely. They stop guarding their assumptions. And sometimes, the person they dismiss is the one paying the most attention. I didn't know then how much those years of comparison were shaping me. I only knew that I was tired of shrinking to make others comfortable. The golden child shone brightly, but even bright light casts shadows. And in those shadows, I was quietly becoming someone far stronger than any of them realized. By the time I turned 26, I had mastered distance. Not dramatic distance. Not loud exits or slammed doors. Just quiet space. I moved into a small apartment across town, found a steady job at a publishing firm, and built a routine that did not depend on the Harper household. I called on holidays. I showed up when required. I kept conversations polite and short. Madison was thriving in the way everyone predicted she would. Her social media was full of filtered vacations, networking events, and smiling group photos. My mother spoke about her as if she were a brand that needed constant promotion. Madison is doing incredible things, Patricia would say to anyone who would listen. She's always been driven. When people asked about me, the answers were simpler. Evelyn is working, she would say. Just working. As if stability was ordinary. As if quiet consistency did not count as success. I stopped correcting the narrative. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was at my desk reviewing a manuscript. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. "Is this Evelyn Harper?" the voice asked. It was calm, professional. Yes. There was a pause that felt heavier than it should have. "I'm calling regarding your grandfather, Theodore Whitmore." My heart dropped before the words even came. "I'm sorry to inform you that he passed away early this morning." Grief is strange when it arrives quietly. I didn't cry right away. I didn't scream. I simply sat there, staring at the stack of papers in front of me, unable to process a world without the one person who had truly seen me. Theodore Whitmore had always felt permanent. Solid. Steady. The one adult in my life whose approval didn't shift with circumstances. The funeral was modest but dignified, just like him. Madison stood beside my mother, offering composed condolences. Patricia accepted sympathy with controlled grace. My father shook hands silently. I stood slightly apart, listening to stories about my grandfather's generosity, his discipline, his intelligence. I already knew those things. What they didn't mention was his attention. His ability to notice what others overlooked. After the service, as people began to disperse, a tall man in a navy suit approached us. "Harper family?" he asked. "I'm Daniel Brooks. Your grandfather's attorney." The name meant little to me at the time. But the tone in his voice did. Measured. Intentional. "There will be a formal reading of the will this Friday," he continued. "Your grandfather left detailed instructions." I saw something flicker across my mother's face. Not sadness. Expectation. Madison's posture straightened slightly. Inheritance changes the temperature of a room, even before it is discussed. Friday arrived faster than I expected. We gathered in Daniel Brooks' office, a space lined with dark shelves and framed certificates. The atmosphere felt official, almost theatrical. Patricia sat confidently, legs crossed, hands folded in her lap. Madison checked her phone once before sliding it into her purse. My father stared at a painting on the wall. I folded my hands together and prepared to feel invisible again. Daniel cleared his throat and opened a folder. Theodore Whitmore left specific allocations for each member of the family, he began. The words were neutral, but the air shifted immediately. He listed donations first. Charities. Educational foundations. Community programs. That sounded like my grandfather. Then he moved to personal assets. A property share to my father. A financial account to my mother. A smaller investment portfolio to Madison. My sister's lips curved into a satisfied smile. It was subtle, but it was there. I felt relief more than anything. Relief that expectations were aligning with reality. That there would be no sudden spotlight on me. Then Daniel paused. It wasn't long, but it was deliberate. He adjusted his glasses and continued. The remainder of the estate, including the primary residence, business holdings, and majority financial accounts, are to be transferred to Evelyn Harper. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The room went completely silent. Not polite silence. Shocked silence. My mother's expression froze. Madison blinked rapidly, as if waiting for clarification. My father finally turned away from the painting. Daniel repeated it calmly, reading directly from the document. There was no confusion. No room for reinterpretation. The majority of Theodore Whitmore's estate was mine. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't calculating numbers. I was trying to understand why. Patricia leaned forward. There must be some mistake, she said carefully. Daniel shook his head. There is no mistake. Your father was very clear. Madison's composure cracked first. Why would he do that? She asked, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it in public. That question lingered in the air. Why would he choose me? For 20 years, I had been treated like the least reliable, the least impressive, the least deserving. And now, in one official statement, that narrative was shattered. I sat there, stunned, while the weight of it settled slowly over the room. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the problem. I wasn't the afterthought. I wasn't the comparison. I was the center of the decision. And no one knew how to respond to that. They say sometimes that one document can change the direction of a life. I never believed that until I saw my grandfather's signature at the bottom of that final page. The air in Daniel Brooks' office felt heavier than before, like the room itself was waiting to see who I would become next. My name had just been spoken in a way it never had before. Not as the blame. Not as the mistake. Not as the quiet comparison. But as the chosen one. Patricia Harper was the first to recover. Father must have been confused toward the end, she said carefully, choosing words that sounded respectful but carried doubt. Madison sat stiffly beside her, her polished composure cracking at the edges. Richard Harper cleared his throat but said nothing. Silence had always been his refuge. Daniel Brooks did not react emotionally. He simply opened another envelope. There is also a personal letter addressed to Evelyn Harper, he said. He slid it across the polished desk toward me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The handwriting was familiar, steady, and deliberate. Theodore Whitmore had always written like he spoke, clear, direct, without unnecessary decoration. Evelyn, the letter began, if you are reading this, then I am no longer there to say these words in person. I want you to know that I have watched you for many years. I have seen your strength when others saw weakness. I have seen your patience when others were impatient. I have seen your character when others were distracted by image. My vision blurred for a moment. I blinked quickly and continued reading. You were never the problem, Evelyn. You were simply the easiest to blame. That is not a flaw. That is a burden placed on those who are strong enough to carry it. The room was silent except for the soft sound of paper in my hands. I am leaving you the majority of my estate not because you need saving, but because you have already proven you can build something meaningful with very little recognition. Wealth is safest in the hands of someone who understands value beyond appearance. I swallowed hard. I hope this gift frees you from any doubt you have carried about your worth. You were always enough. Love, grandfather. The letter ended there. No dramatic flourish. No explanation for the others. Just truth. I lowered the paper slowly. No one met my eyes at first. Madison looked confused more than angry, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that had never required effort before. Patricia's lips were pressed tightly together. The certainty she carried into the room had dissolved into disbelief. For 20 years, the narrative had been clear. Madison was the success story. I was the complication. That story had shaped every dinner, every holiday, every quiet comparison. But now there was evidence, written in ink and sealed in law, that contradicted it completely. The strangest part was that I did not feel victorious. I did not feel superior. I felt steady. Calm in a way I had never experienced inside my family's presence. For once, I did not need to defend myself. I did not need to explain who I was. Someone else had already done it, in the most permanent way possible. Madison finally spoke. I just don't understand, she said softly. There was no accusation in her voice this time. Only confusion. Why didn't he ever say anything? I folded the letter carefully before answering. Maybe he didn't need to, I said. Because the truth is, some people show their support quietly. They don't argue in public. They don't create scenes. They observe. They decide. And when the time is right, they act. Daniel began outlining the legal steps that would follow. Property transfers. Account changes. Signatures required. His voice sounded distant, almost secondary to the realization settling over the room. My identity had shifted without my effort. Not because I demanded recognition. Not because I forced fairness. But because someone who had watched carefully believed in what he saw. When we stepped outside the office building, the sun felt brighter than usual. The world had not changed. Cars still passed. People still hurried along sidewalks. But something inside me had realigned. For years, I had questioned my own memory of events. Wondered if maybe I really was careless. Too sensitive. Too difficult. Now I understood something powerful. Being misunderstood does not mean being wrong. My mother approached me near the curb. Her voice was controlled, but softer than I expected. Evelyn, we should talk about this as a family. For the first time, the word family did not feel like a cage. It felt like a choice. And choices were new territory for me. We can talk, I replied calmly. But this isn't something to fix. Because that was the difference now. There was nothing broken in me that needed repair. There was nothing to apologize for. My grandfather had not just left me an inheritance. He had left clarity. And clarity is more valuable than money. As I walked toward my car, I thought about the years I spent shrinking myself to fit into a story that never belonged to me. I thought about every time I doubted my instincts. Every time I accepted blame to keep peace. And I realized something that felt almost revolutionary. I had survived all of it without becoming bitter. Theodore Whitmore had seen that. He had trusted that. And now, standing in the sunlight with his letter folded safely in my hand, I understood that the greatest inheritance was not the estate. It was the confirmation that I was never the scapegoat. I was the one quietly becoming stronger while everyone else was distracted by shine. Sometimes justice does not shout. Sometimes it signs its name quietly at the bottom of a page and waits for the truth to unfold. The weeks after the reading of the will were not loud or dramatic. There were no shouting matches on front lawns. No public scenes. What changed was quieter than that. It was the shift in how people looked at me. For the first time in my life, the Harper family did not look at Evelyn Harper as the easiest answer to every problem. They looked at me with uncertainty. And uncertainty, I learned, is what happens when a long-standing story collapses. Patricia called 3 days after the meeting. Her voice carried something unfamiliar. Caution. We should have dinner, she said. Not a command. Not an announcement. A suggestion. We met at the same dining table where I had once been blamed for a broken glass. The house looked the same, but it felt smaller. Madison was already seated, her posture composed but not as confident as before. My father nodded at me gently when I walked in. Dinner began with safe conversation. Weather. Work. Traffic. The kind of topics families use when they are afraid to address what actually matters. Finally, my mother set her fork down. I didn't realize your grandfather felt that way, she said carefully. It wasn't an apology. But it was the closest she had ever come. I looked around the table, at the same faces that had once defined me with a single sentence. It must have been Evelyn. I felt no anger rising inside me. Just clarity. He saw things differently, I replied. That doesn't mean anyone failed. It just means he paid attention. Madison shifted in her seat. Did you know? She asked. No, I answered honestly. I didn't. And that was the truth. I hadn't expected recognition. I hadn't waited for revenge. I had simply learned to build quietly. The inheritance did not make me stronger. It revealed that I already was. Over the next few months, the legal process moved forward. Assets were transferred. Documents were signed. I visited my grandfather's property alone for the first time one afternoon. The house stood peacefully, surrounded by tall trees and silence. When I stepped inside, the air carried the faint scent of old books and polished wood. I walked through each room slowly, remembering Sunday conversations at the kitchen table, the way he would listen without interrupting. The study was exactly as he had left it. His chair still angled toward the window. A pen resting neatly beside a closed notebook. I sat down in that chair and allowed myself to feel everything at once. The years of doubt. The quiet endurance. The small victories no one applauded. And then I felt something stronger than all of it. Freedom. For 20 years, I had tried to prove I wasn't the problem. Now I no longer needed to prove anything. Not to my mother. Not to Madison. Not even to myself. The money gave me options, yes. I invested carefully. I expanded my work in publishing. I supported literacy programs in my grandfather's name. But the true inheritance was internal. It was the understanding that I had survived misjudgment without losing my kindness. I had endured comparison without becoming cruel. I had been underestimated without shrinking permanently. One evening, Madison visited my apartment alone. There was no audience this time. No parental presence. She stood awkwardly near the doorway. I think I got used to being the favorite, she admitted quietly. I didn't question it. Her honesty surprised me more than the confession itself. It wasn't your job to question it, I said gently. We were both placed in roles. She nodded slowly. I'm starting to see that. That conversation did not erase the past. But it softened it. And sometimes healing does not arrive as a dramatic transformation. Sometimes it arrives as awareness. My relationship with my parents changed too. Not perfectly. Not magically. But differently. There was more listening. Less assumption. Patricia began asking about my projects with genuine curiosity. My father spoke up occasionally when conversations leaned unfairly. Small changes. Quiet corrections. And I realized something powerful. When the scapegoat steps out of the role, the entire system must adjust. Looking back now, I understand that this story was never truly about money. It was about narrative. For years, my family believed one version of me because it was convenient. It protected comfort. It protected hierarchy. But truth has a way of waiting patiently until it can no longer be ignored. Theodore Whitmore did not defend me loudly during those dinners long ago. He did something more lasting. He documented what he saw. He affirmed it in ink. He ensured that one day, the truth would stand on its own. And it did. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like the one blamed first, remember this, being the scapegoat often means you are strong enough to carry what others avoid. But you do not have to carry it forever. One day, clarity comes. One day, the story shifts. Today, I stand not as the family scapegoat, not as the forgotten daughter, but as Evelyn Harper. Whole. Steady. Certain of my worth. If this story touched you, let me know in the comments which country you are watching from. Your voice matters more than you realize. Every comment is encouragement. Every shared experience inspires more stories like this to be written and told. When you engage, you help these stories reach others who may need them. And if you have ever walked through something similar, your words could be the comfort someone else is searching for. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not wealth. It is validation. It is freedom. It is the moment you finally see yourself clearly, even if others took years to do the same. And that is how the scapegoat became the author of her own story.